Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. Talking about Active Directory again, big surprise, I know. But one of the things that I've been mentioning in recent videos is the fact that Active Directory has multi-master replication, where every domain controller replicates to the other domain controllers. And you might think, okay, so does this mean like a big multinational corporation just has domain controllers that are randomly trying to replicate to other domain controllers all over the globe? They could. Most of them don't. And so in order to make sense of how Active Directory works at scale like that, it's time for me to talk about another Active Directory construct, and that is a site. If you think back to the earliest days of the NT4 domain, and then when Active Directory was introduced in 2000, it's not like we had broadband anywhere. Or not most places anyway. It's not like we had it everywhere. So what you would typically have was a building, and within the building, you would probably have Ethernet running at 10, maybe 100 megabit. And within that building was pretty speedy, pretty much guaranteed to always be there. You just had the network installed. But when it came to external connectivity, you would typically have something like an ISDN line, a T1, maybe even dial-up for small or remote sites where you didn't have the infrastructure necessary to support a T1 or an E1 or any of the other lines that you could actually provision permanently. So you had these essentially islands of high-speed connectivity joined by links that were not as fast and not guaranteed to be available all the time. Some of them might have had technologies like dial on demand, or it might have had the ability to use some of that bandwidth. But if you had a line like that, it was very much more limited connectivity than we have these days. A T1 line was only 1.5 megabit, give or take. Technically 1.518 megabit, but who's counting? And so a large part of that you would want reserved for your staff to be able to use, and you wouldn't necessarily want that devoted to replication traffic all the time anyway. So Active Directory was built with the concept of a site. This is not on the level of a domain, because if you think about your big multinational umbrella corporation that has different companies underneath it, those companies are roughly where you would find a domain. And you might have subdomains if you have different business units that have their own administration and their own administrative policies and their own IT team. Okay, fine. But within a domain, you have sites. And we actually saw this very briefly when I was doing the video on building a new domain. There was an option to select the site. There was only one site. It was the default first site. Okay, fine, sure. But if you have multiple sites and you're adding a new domain controller, that lets you specify which site that domain controller is a part of. These sites are essentially understood to be what I described at the very beginning. A self-contained area, however the administrator wants to define an area, where you have high-speed, reliable, always-on links. And within a site, yes, all domain controllers replicate to each other pretty much continuously. It's almost in real time. But if you cross a boundary to a different site, within that site, everything's replicating to each other constantly. But the two sites will only replicate, I think the default is something like every 6 hours. And then Active Directory will essentially say, okay, there's a server here, there is a server here. I'm going to create a connection between them to pass replication traffic from one site to another using these bridgehead servers. And then the bridgehead in the other site can replicate all the updates from there into the site. So between sites, it's only two domain controllers, one on each site, that talk to each other to exchange this larger replication update. The concept of a site, then, is used to determine a bunch of other features of Active Directory by determining what is local to each server or to each user. So, for example, if you're using distributed file system namespace, DFSN. DFSN, broadly speaking, is a way that you can use the domain name as the server name and then specify a share. So if you say /nextdoornetadmin.ca/ super special files, just because regular files wasn't interesting enough, right? If you have that might actually forward to several different servers that are hosting a file share named super special files. How does Active Directory determine which one to forward to? Well, one of the first things it looks at is which site is the user in, because it makes sense to forward the user to a local copy of the share rather than one that's halfway across the globe. You'll get better latency, even on a broadband connection. You'll get way better latency if you're talking to the server that's, in the hall 2 floors down than talking to something all the way across the globe. So it'll try to redirect a user to an available server that is local to them first, and then it will progressively move on to redirecting them to servers that are further away if the closer ones, the local ones, are not responding or if they're not online at the time. So that's one thing. But how does Active Directory know what site a user is in? Well, every site has an administrator-defined list of subnets associated with it. When you are promoting a domain controller, you specify which site that domain controller is a part of, fine. But that's the only thing. Member servers and user accounts and workstations don't get that specified anywhere at all. So Active Directory uses their IP address to determine which site they are local to. So when an administrator sets up a site, and this is something that you do through the appropriately named tool, Active Directory Sites and Services, you define a list of subnets and you associate those subnets to a site. And if you have multiple sites with subnets defined and somebody logs in from an IP address that isn't defined yet, you get a warning message in your Windows logs saying, somebody's logging into the domain from a subnet that's not defined. I'm going to consider them part of the default site because I don't know what else to do. Okay, fine and fair enough. But an administrator who's, doing review of these logs might see that and go, oh, we had a network update. We've added a few new subnets. I need to actually tell Active Directory about these and put them in the right sites so that when a user logs in, Active Directory knows, oh, they're logging into site B, they're logging into Berlin, wherever, and it can point them to local services efficiently. Sites are connected, like I said, but you have to tell Active Directory how they're connected. Which sites have connectivity to each other? Surely, If you're thinking back in the 2000 days when Active Directory first came out, it wasn't a guarantee that every site had connectivity to every other site at will. You might have a network connection that is set up to talk to the main site, the head site only. You might have a site that has connectivity to 3 different sites because it happens to be a little more centralized. Maybe it's a regional headquarters and it's talking to 3 remote offices, and then it has a leased line, a permanent connection to head office. Active Directory is okay with that. You can specify a site link, typically an IP site link, but Active Directory also actually has the capability to use SMTP as a site link. And it's not email in the traditional sense that you would think of with SMTP. It's not like it's sending a message, but it's using the SMTP protocol to essentially make a connection to another server and exchange replication data. I've never used that. I've never configured that, but I've seen it as an option. And it's interesting to think about from a legacy perspective, because maybe you have a system that doesn't actually connect by IP. We're talking back in 2000 here. We're talking when you had very different layer 2, and IP is layer 3. You had very different layer 2 architectures as well. Maybe instead of Ethernet, it was token ring. But perhaps instead of IP, it was using IPX, SPX, the Novell-based networking protocol. So maybe an IP site link wasn't a thing that your site had, but maybe it could use SMTP over top of whatever networking protocol it was using in order to establish a connection. Creative thinking. Legacy creative thinking at this point, but these are the kinds of things that were built. So that's a fun little footnote. But when you define a site link, you explain which sites can exchange data using this site link. It might be that you have multiple sites that can exchange data using this site link. 3 sites that can all talk to each other. Or maybe it's something more hub and spoke, like the regional office I mentioned, where you say regional office has a site link to here, a site link to here, a site link to here, and then a leased line that goes to main office. You'll want 4 different site link objects. And you'll probably want to define different thresholds for how much replication traffic you can use over those links. You might want to specify when those links are available. Maybe they're not available during business hours because you have to reserve the capacity for staff, and then replication only happens at night. And this is where functions like the RID master that I mentioned last week become so crucial, because you have no guarantee that somebody else in another site isn't going to use the same object identifiers that you want to use during your business hours. So this is why every domain controller has to be allocated its own pool of RIDs for potential work that needs to be done before these sites can replicate to each other. So, yeah. Sites are a big thing in Active Directory in terms of scalability. You can absolutely just leave everything at the default first site and have everything talking to each other as if it's local to each other. But that's not going to be helpful. That's not going to be useful to you. You really do want to define sites. Maybe you don't need to do it on the level of every building. If you have a single campus where all the buildings essentially share the same network architecture, and it's just Ethernet lines and fiber that have been strung in between the buildings, maybe a campus is an entire site. That's perfectly acceptable. You add a bunch of subnets to the site in Active Directory, and Active Directory considers that a single local network. Cool. Maybe it works better for you to have sites be individual buildings. Maybe you have a mix. Maybe you have a big campus here and a small little remote office over there that only has 10 users. Again, Active Directory will let you set up whatever you want. It's up to the administrator to define what a site is and what a site contains and how the sites are connected to each other. And once you do that, Active Directory is perfectly happy to go out and, actually validate the topology and say, okay, this is what I've been told by the administrator to expect. So I'm just going to confirm, can I talk to this system? Can I talk to that system? Is it reachable? Is it offline? How's everything working together? And then it will try and replicate over whatever links it can in whatever fashion it can, as configured by an admin. This is a very admin heavy protocol at this level. It doesn't really do self-assembly, not on this level. So that gives it the flexibility, but that also means that you kind of need to know what you're doing with it. But again, that is mainly at scale, because if you're a small business with your own domain, a single building or a few buildings, yeah, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. Even if you've only got, 3 sites, in today's day and age where everybody has a broadband connection and you can just set up VPN from, site to site, keeping 3 sites talking to each other is not as difficult as it used to be, although it's still susceptible to error. If for whatever reason your VPN goes down and your domain controllers stop talking to each other, then that has the potential to break things fairly quickly. And I've had to deal with those broken connections several times in my career as an admin. So, it's not without its dangers, we'll put it that way. But it's doable. You can absolutely do that. But in a situation where you have multiple sites and you're a large corporation with many, many, many sites, it's definitely going to be important to tell Active Directory about those sites so that it can build the network and run the network more efficiently. Okay, that's probably enough on that topic for now. Hopefully it has been enlightening for you, thought-provoking even. If you have thoughts on other things that you would like to hear me talk about or things that you would like to see me demonstrate, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door NetAdmin, and we will see you next time.